Did he already knock? Oh, there he is. Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to the Administrative Committee meeting. Walter and Art are joining me, and we're going to get started with the approval of Administrative Committee minutes from February 13th.
I would move approval of those minutes.
And I did not attend, so I will abstain.
Second and vote.
And they look really good, so they're fine. Second item on the agenda, proposed amendment of Title IV, Chapter 6 regarding off-street parking requirements with Michael Ray. This is exciting. I like it.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
Not quite.
Not on.
Okay, so this is a project Planning and Zoning Commission's been working on for about the last year. It's just the next step in our update to the zoning code that we've been working on over the last few years, and it's Chapter 6 regarding our off-street parking requirements within the zoning code. So taking a look at, just a broad overview about what is commonly considered when you look at parking lot requirements. Generally, you have sections about when the standards apply. You always have a definition of what a stall is, as far as dimensionally, the adjacent travel lanes, public access into the streets. You always have surfacing curbing, so when it's required to be paved, curbing that's required. Alternates to maybe asphalt or concrete are typically considered as well. Landscaping, so exterior screening, usually you have internal landscaping as well as external landscaping to mitigate some of the effects of parking lots onto adjacent properties. Some of that interior landscaping, usually it's divided up into islands within a parking lot, is usually included within the interior landscaping. We usually take a look at shading, so reducing the urban heat island effect through the planting of trees, requirements of trees within parking lots, and also to reduce some of the stormwater impacts that we'll most likely see coming down the line with our Phase 2 here in the future. Stormwater treatment, so detention, quality, reducing the discharge into the system. Usually account for pedestrian facilities. This is usually accommodated in larger parking lots. There's ADA accessibility as well. Usually we don't get into this in a whole lot of detail other than Legacy Crossing District, but where parking is located on site. Good common practice is located to the side or rear when there's an urban environment to push the building up towards the street. Quantity of stalls, so usually you have a minimum required depending upon what the use is, and then in certain circumstances you have a maximum, so restricting maybe it's 150% of what would be the minimum required by the code is a common maximum requirement in some jurisdictions. We only have that within Legacy Crossing is the only district that we utilize that. Joint use parking, so you maybe have nighttime and daytime uses, and whether or not you can utilize the same parking lot to satisfy the parking requirement within those. And then you have off-site parking, so parking that's not located on the site or directly adjacent. Maybe it's a certain distance away. So when we're looking at the overall intent of this code amendment that we're going through, I guess the foremost is that there are a lot of inconsistencies throughout the section. We use multiple terminology to describe the same thing. We have parking lot, parking facility, parking space. Those are all terms that are used interchangeably throughout the section. So correcting those inconsistencies, providing some greater flexibility, so there's certain things like joint use parking lots, off-site parking lots that we require a conditional use permit review, and so that costs time and money for the applicant and staff, and it goes through the public hearing process through the Board of Adjustment. A little bit onerous in order to just review parking that's located off-site or joint use, and these are things that staff would be able to review and approve and looking at other jurisdictions, they commonly do. And then restructuring some sections for ease of use, and so a lot of this is in paragraph format and breaking it down into subsections. A lot easier on the eyes, a lot easier to read and work with. So we're looking at doing that. Inserting illustrations. A picture's worth 1,000 words sometimes, and so just inserting illustrations as to what the requirements are. The big one for us is requirements that are in other portions of maybe a building code or ANSI code requirements for accessibility, and just combining those into this one central location so we can give those out to the public, since we're always seems to be asked those questions and try to dig that up. So just putting a centralized location for those, and then ensure greater consistency in how the requirements are administered. And I think that this pertains a lot to the landscaping requirements and moving towards greater consistency with how those are implemented. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the current inconsistencies that we've been working with over the years with landscaping. So just wanted to give an example of all these terms that we currently have and trying to clean those up. So parking area, I didn't mention that one. Parking lot, parking facility, parking space. And then in the definition section, we're not proposing to change any definitions right now. We're going to end up wrapping that up into another code amendment, our use table code amendment. That's going to revise sections 1 through 4, or chapters 1 through 4 of the zoning code. And so that'll be coming up here in the next month or so. And so we're going to be looking at all the definitions and revising some of those as part of that project. So we'll just be cleaning that up at that time. But you can see some of the inconsistencies with, say, parking space. So over the years of new zoning codes, obviously that's another definition that was transposed over that parking space definition. And so that was just one of those errors that propagated itself throughout future codes. So we'll work on clearing that up. Through the background, we had gone out and this is common to other code amendments that we typically do, researched about 10 other jurisdictions throughout the state and the region. We looked at Boise, Caldwell, Coeur d'Alene, Lewiston, Meridian, Missoula, Nampa, Pullman, Sandpoint, and Twin Falls as part of this project. Staff went through and tried to clean up as many of the inconsistencies as we could with all the terminology, syncing that together. We reviewed all sections and made recommended changes to the Commission. And then the Commission wanted to create a parking standards advisory committee, and that was comprised of people that typically deal with these requirements, could be on a daily or yearly basis. They met 3 times, December 21st of last year, January 25th of 2017, and March 1st of this year as well. Met on the noon hour, and they provided a lot of good recommendations that we brought back to the Commission, and the Commission ended up incorporating all their proposed changes within the ordinance. So we got a lot of good feedback, and I just wanted to take a minute to highlight or recognize the people that served on that committee. We had David Rock, who works at the U of I. He's on the Tree Commission as well. He's a horticulturalist. Rich Beebe, who's a local contractor, builds parking lots as part of his projects. Scott Becker, civil engineer. He works on a lot of parking lot design and street projects here in town and private development projects, so he had good input. Matt Decker, he owns a landscape company, so he's a contractor, and they're the ones that usually end up putting in a lot of the landscaping that you see for new projects around town. So he provided a lot of good insight as far as the landscaping requirements. We had Susan Wilson, who's a land use attorney in town. Victoria was on the committee as a citizen, but she's also on the Sustainable Environment Commission. And then we had a couple P&Z reps. We had Wendy, who's the chair, and then Greg Dickinson, who's also on Planning and Zoning Commission. So just going through chronologically here in the ordinance. So we start off when the requirements apply. So usually at new structure or use, change in use, expansion of use, alterations. We were originally not planning on changing anything within this section, but we did have an interpretation. We had a Board of Adjustment meeting where the board was looking at an interpretation of this section to mean that pretty much disregarding the change of use section. So usually the way it works is, say you have an existing building and they maybe have 0 parking stalls on site. So you're looking at the North Main corridor. The building's built right out to the property lines, and you have, so 5 would normally be required, but they don't have any on the property. A new use goes in there that requires 10 parking spaces. So we don't retroactively go back and require them to have 10 spaces. We just require the difference of what they were supposed to have right now and what the new use is going to have. So we essentially give them credit for those 5 spaces that they don't have, and then make up the difference for what the new use. And so in this circumstance, they wouldn't have to go back and put 10 in. They would just be required to meet a five stall parking lot requirement because it's just the difference. And so what the board was interpreting this to mean was that any use that went into an existing building that was typically a change of use is a new use going into the building. And so they were applying the new use portion of this, which would mean that it have a few implications. So if you were to say that same scenario on North Main, you had no parking lot at all, they were required to have 5 spaces. Even if a new use went in there that maybe required 5 as well, and so they didn't need to do anything. What this would mean with their interpretation would mean that they'd have to either go out and try to find parking elsewhere or possibly tear down a portion of that building to build a parking lot. And so, in the sense of infill, promoting more infill gentrification, especially the areas close to downtown, that would be contrary to that. So we essentially just went through and wanted to clarify our current interpretation of the code, and so that's what we've done. Spelled that out pretty well. There's really nothing that's changing a whole lot other than we're looking at increasing the credit that's given. So right now you would get 100% credit for what you currently maybe don't have, but you're maybe required to have. So we're given a little bit of flexibility to add another 10% on there in order to, say that 10's required, they don't have it, new use comes in and they need 11. Well, then they don't need to provide, it gives a little bit of leeway there in order for new uses to come into existing buildings. And so that's really, it looks like a lot of changes within that section, but it's really just trying to systematically spell out exactly what our interpretation has been in the past and then carry that one forward. Surfacing, we have a portion of the code that, so we require, in our performance standards for paving, we have concrete and asphalt, and then we also have the ability for an alternate surface as long as it's of similar durability and utility, adequately maintained. And so that's what we currently have within that section. We also have a portion that allows the parking lot, at least the paving, to be temporarily surfaced through a development agreement for 5 years. So you're not allowed or you're able to defer the paving for that period of 5 years. We were looking at eliminating the 5-year requirement and clarifying kind of the section at the very beginning. So under the general provisions, we allow an extension right now up to 18 months for anything within the parking lot that may not be completed. So we'll give you a temporary certificate of occupancy. Since 18 months is quite a long period of time. Usually you're only deferring those improvements because of weather or some other unforeseen circumstance. We reduced that to 6 months, and through the Parking Standards Advisory Committee, we're fine with that. They would just wanted to have the ability of the zoning administrator to allow another 6-month extension beyond the 6 months that we would allow up to a year. And so, maybe there's some other unforeseen, settling of ground or some other unusual circumstance that we need to accommodate another extension. And so, which we work with people anyway on those types of things, but they wanted to add that in there. And then the portion on the surfacing weren't going to touch the thickness for the concrete and asphalt. In review of the other jurisdictions that we had looked at, those were pretty common across all jurisdictions. 2 inches for Portland cement or 4 inches for asphalt. Yes, Walter.
That was the one.
That was the question.
The question about whether or not you should go ahead and state that there should be some reinforcing wire in the concrete at this point or not.
Yeah, and you know, we could certainly specify that. I think that I think we're a little
we're appropriate here,
Yeah.
or that engineering needs to catch it up. But
Yeah.
you don't want. I don't think you want 4 inches of concrete without any wire in it.
Yeah, and this is something engineering looks at. Usually, we're a little more concerned with improvements in the public right-of-way, which this would be a private parking lot.
You still want it to stay there.
Okay. Yeah, we can. We could look at potentially, specifying that in the language.
Okay.
And while you're going over there, it was because there's just so much in this ordinance that was undone and redone. I remember the 18 months was the cutoff from the 5 years, but what if they don't finish their parking lot?
Well, they would never get a full certificate of occupancy. So we usually, if there's incomplete improvements, then we would work with the owner to give them a temporary certificate of occupancy in order to open up and conduct business. We can, usually that expires, so we'll give them a temp CO for 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as that expires, then they cannot occupy the building unless they get another extension on that temporary certificate of occupancy. So that's really the carrot that we have to dangle, you know, in as far as you know, if they don't do the improvements, then they aren't able to occupy the building and conduct business. And so that's a big incentive to get the parking lot done.
But I didn't hear all of that, but you're letting them in the first place and giving them 6 months to finish the lot.
Correct. 6 months, and then it'd be
and to Catherine's question, so they don't do it.
Then you withdraw.
Do you
Well,
have any leverage after the fact? I mean, you
Yeah,
can't, you can't pull an occupancy permit after the fact, can you?
Because it's temporary.
Yeah.
Temporary.
Yeah.
Certificate of occupancy for failure to comply with the
Okay.
Yeah, easily
condition.
revoked, but, you know, we only issue a full certificate of occupancy after they've completed all the improvements. And so then, after that, they go out of compliance, and then we could revoke it. But usually temporary certificate of occupancies, they have an expiration date. So we'd set that for 6 months. It would automatically expire, and then they would need a new temporary certificate or the full certificate of occupancy.
Okay.
So it would take care of itself. At the very end of, we just wanted to specify alternate surfacing. Just expand on that statement to include approval by the city engineer. So the engineering department, city engineer is the one who has the education, you know, the eye to be able to look at an alternate surfacing in order to be able to approve that. And so we put that in his court right now in order to approve alternate surfacing. We'd be proposing to strike the 5-year deferral of just the paving. Curbing, not a whole lot of changes. So right now we just say that you know, interior landscaping, interior parking areas need to be contained by the curbing. We do have a rather antiquated language of bumper rail, and so what we're proposing to do is just eliminate the bumper rail but keep the requirements just as they are. It brings us to off-site parking. So right now, like I had mentioned, we go through the Board of Adjustment through a conditional use permit if you want to go off-site. We specify distances for multifamily. It's 100 feet. And then we have this odd other category that lists hospitals, sanitariums, asylums, rooming and boarding houses, similar uses 300 feet. So, you know, those are rather antiquated terms as well. I don't know that we even allow sanitariums or asylums as uses under the code. So we'd be proposing to update that. And then the catch-all category at the end is all uses 500 feet other than those specified above. So we'd be trying to clean up that section, moving towards conditional use permit approval through zoning administrator approval, and then have the specifications for, moving these grouping of uses. So we had multifamily, so we're just going to say all residential uses. So we'd be bringing up rooming and boarding houses and similar uses, and then just including all residential other than single and two family. The committee wanted to increase the 100-foot requirement. If you think about 100 feet, the typical lot width, well, in the core of town is probably 50 feet. In suburban areas, it's more 60, 70 feet in R2, R3 zones. So that's not, that's maybe a property over from the current property. And so they wanted to expand that up to 250 feet, and staff and the commission were fine with that increase. And then we just proposed to eliminate the second category with those antiquated terms, and that would just be captured under the new subsection 2 at the very end for 500 feet. So hospitals would end up falling under that category as well. So that's the crux of the changes within that section.
Mike, would you go back to the curbing for a moment, please? Do you allow in parking lots a poured asphalt curb that's just laid on the top of asphalt? Not your standard city street curbing that goes down into the ground below the level of the street. Can you do that poured asphalt curb?
Typically not. It would just have to be a traditional curb and meet the specifications here.
Does this need to say that, if that's what you mean?
I could certainly clarify that, sure. I think this means...
if I were doing a parking lot, I would like to have the poured curb because it's less expensive than doing the other. I just wondered which one you were intending for them to use and whether or not you shouldn't say so. The problem with those poured curbs is if they get hit very hard at all, they break and come apart.
Okay.
Do they use those in this climate?
I've seen them used, yeah.
Where? No, like seriously.
Saw one in Salt Lake City on the weekend. It was
Well,
busted.
I guess what I mean, because when you said that, it made me think of like the Disney World curbing. Like everything's really smooth. It's like that. Is that the kind of curbing you're talking about?
No, I think that's in areas where you've got pedestrians. That's not where you've got cars that can bump up against it.
So you're thinking more of a rolled curb, like in a...
It's an extruded asphalt curb, and it just lies on top of asphalt. It performs a curb. It will channel water, but if you hit it with a car wheel, you're very likely to just break it or misplace it. And I didn't know if your language was intended to preclude that or not. That's all.
Do we have any of that around here?
I could go out and look. Bill, we got any around here?
No,
Bill's going to tell you where it is.
I know. Well, Walter, the reason I'm asking you is because you sound like specifically you're talking about some particular area.
If you're referring to an extruded concrete curb or extruded asphalt curb.
I've also seen extruded concrete.
Extruded concrete.
I'm just wondering which one what do y'all want?
Generally, if they provided either asphalt or concrete curb that provided the same function, it would probably qualify and meet the code requirements under the code as it's written today. I've seen more problems with extruded concrete curbs because there's really no physical method of attachment other than sometimes they're pinned down with rebar. Those are the ones that if you're in snow removal operations and you hit them with a plow, it can break fairly easily. Extruded asphalt tends to hold together a little bit better, but we really haven't had anybody try to utilize extruded curbing on any projects in this climate just because they don't tend to be durable in the long run.
Well, just was asking, do you wish to speak to it or not?
We hadn't considered it previously, but we certainly can.
I'm not particularly suggesting you do or don't,
Just asking.
was wondering which one you were talking, what you were talking about.
At this point, as long as it met the functional requirement of the code, it's really up to the owner to decide about durability and their long-term maintenance costs. We can certainly consider specifying a Type A curb, which would be, a cast-in-place curb.
That may be overkill for a parking lot.
Right. So we can certainly consider that.
Okay.
Thanks.
Brings us to our joint use section. So this is the section that allows maybe a single parking lot to be utilized by nighttime or daytime uses to satisfy their off-street parking requirement. Right now, like I mentioned previously, it goes to the Board of Adjustment through a conditional use permit in order for them to authorize joint use of parking lots. Can't be further than 500 feet away from the building it is to serve. And then we go through certain sections that discuss, only up to 50% of the facilities for nighttime uses may be supplied by daytime uses and vice versa. So you're really restricted to that 50%, except if you're a church, then you're allowed to go all the way up to 100%. What we be proposing to do for this section is, once again, shift it from Board of Adjustment through a conditional use permit to zoning administrator approval. And then the committee wanted to increase or recommended that we increase the 50% right now up to 85%. And so, looking at other jurisdictions, most are around the 80 to 90%. You want to accommodate some type of overlap. So, say you have an office that would qualify as a daytime use. Well, some people could stay past 5. So some people leave early, some people stay past 5. You could have a nighttime use, maybe it's a gym or a bar. Employees show up 15 minutes early for work, and then you're going to have this overlap conflict going on. So usually you don't go all the way up to 100%, and so that's why we left it at 85% and thought that was a happy median there for the joint use of parking lots. So. That would be the proposed changes for that section. We have a parking lot diagram, our standards that go through stall dimensions, travel aisle dimensions. A lot of it depends on whether or not you're going for two-way or one-way traffic through a parking lot. This has worked fairly well up to this point. We did want to look at maybe the compact spaces and those percentages. And right now the compact stall is 7.5 feet wide by 15 feet deep. And 7.5 feet wide, as probably many know, is not very wide. You have issues even if you're in a compact car fitting in a compact space. The committee wanted to increase the allowance of compact spaces. So right now we restrict that to 25% of the total which is required of the parking lot. In review of other jurisdictions, a lot of them ranged in the 20 to 30%. Pullman had 2 different standards depending upon whether or not you were in residential parking lot or commercial parking lot, which is problematic because those things change over time. You have changes of use. And so the committee wanted to increase that to 35%. Staff came back with a compromise to increase from 7.5 feet on the width to bring that up to a solid 8 feet. And the committee was fine with that compromise, and the commission ended up, with the committee's recommendation, thought that was good as well. And so they went with that.
This is horribly pedantic, but how are you measuring the lot width? Is it inside the painted stripe, halfway through the painted stripe? Where's
It's usually the center of the painted stripe is how you measure that.
Yep. Yeah. So I think the increase is good. My car doors would thank you from other people.
Mine was on the stalls too. It wasn't. I like the width adjustment was definitely necessary. But what about the length? Because of all the pickups that have long beds that come out into the right of way. Did you all talk about?
That's not a
We're just going to
compact
ban
car.
those.
Yeah, I know it's not a compact. But did you all end up addressing that too in the?
Well, usually 20 feet, even if you have a long bed pickup, 20 feet usually accommodates those larger pickups. You usually have a wheel stop with a 2-foot overhang, and so the whole 20 feet would typically accommodate those trucks. They shouldn't be parking in a compact space with those type of vehicles. So, yeah, in looking at all those other jurisdictions, it was pretty standard that a standard stall is 9 feet wide by 20 feet deep, and that really didn't deviate between those requirements. So being as though compacts aren't really intended for those larger trucks, we didn't feel a need to adjust the length of a compact space. And we don't really run into very many issues with a 15-foot deep space. It's really just the width and the door clearance is where it gets tight. So
People aren't opening up the back of their pickup.
Well, they have usually adjacent travel lane behind that, and so it may be infrequent to have somebody open the back, but they'd be out in the travel lane, and they have additional space. Usually it's 24 feet for a travel lane for perpendicular spaces, so they'd have that increase area within the travel lane in order to do things like that.
Okay.
So that was the only real change within the dimensional parking lot standards section. What that now brings us to is tandem parking. So within the code, we allow single family, two family. We allow we allow spaces to be tandem. A couple years ago, I believe in 2014, we ended up at the request of a developer looking at adding tandem parking for multifamily developments. And so, our concern has always been where guests park, where visitors park on high-use days, maybe like Super Bowl Sunday. And so the tandem parking section that we currently have allows multifamily dwellings to have tandem parking, but there's specific requirements. The purpose of the parking design is to provide enclosed garages for the residents. Tandem spaces have to be assigned and furnished by use of the occupants, so they can't rent them out as storage, to somebody that lives off-site. And then the garage space is only counted as 1/4 of a parking space towards satisfying the number of required off-street parking spaces for that use. And so, working through the committee, there was one member of the committee that had dealt with a project, constructing multifamily projects that actually utilize a tandem parking space. So they had a higher-end multifamily development that all had garages, for a single-car garage for each unit. And we had taken a look at that site, and they really wanted to increase how much was counted. So the quarter, they ended up with just an overly substantial number of parking spaces on the site if you look at the number of garage spaces as well. And so we were, trying to work with the committee's concern with wanting to increase that, but also account for our concern with the visitor parking. So if you have a garage, maybe people fill it with their stuff instead of a car. And then you have their space in front of it that's reserved for their unit. Well, if they just have those two spaces, then their cars park there where the visitors to park on those high-use days. And so what we had compromised on was to count the spaces 100% within the garage, but no more than 50% of the required parking may be provided in the tandem configuration. So that was going to account for our concern, but also allow for those spaces to be counted at 100%. Yes, Walter.
In 2I, the last line, what does without separate additional compensation mean?
That is to specifically spell out that you're not allowed to have one of those garage units and all of a sudden rent it out as a storage unit. So we had some circumstances where people were building garages on multifamily units and then in turn renting them out as storage units to people that actually didn't live on site. But they were satisfying their parking requirement by building that space. So that'd be like double dipping.
That's not the landlord charging for spaces, it is?
Correct. That's to spell that out so that doesn't happen.
Right.
The new apartment complex going down to the South Couplet, though, is charging for parking on their property.
They are. But they don't have any tandem spaces.
So this would apply there if they had tandem spaces.
In garages.
This phrase.
Yeah, if they had tandem spaces in garages,
Okay.
it would apply.
Okay. But in their case, since they don't, it doesn't.
Correct.
Okay.
Then we'd be adding a specific zone exemptions section. And this is, there's really nothing new here except for the very end. We're just taking and consolidating portions of our code already. So central business, we exempt out parking, so off-street parking is not required in the CB zone. And then urban mixed commercial, we'd be taking this. This currently resides underneath the, it'd be Chapter 3, which goes through the commercial zoning districts. So it's hidden within the end of the urban mixed commercial zone. So it goes through, all the intents of that zone, setback requirements, uses, and then this is at the very end under limitations on uses. And so we'd be proposing to strike it from that section and consolidate it in the parking section where it should be. And then, so this is all, none of this has changed. This is all remaining the same, just being relocated, as well as the maximum off-street parking. One new addition would be the university zoning district. We would just be stating that off-street parking is not required in the U zone because the university manages their parking through the Parking and Transportation Services Department. So right now, if it's zoned university, under our current code, it says that it needs to be owned by the university. And so with them managing their own development and parking, we would just be stating more of the obvious with that statement in there, but wanted to include so there was no confusion as to whether or not they were exempt or not.
Yeah, go ahead.
Mike, what about the public right-of-way city streets that the university manages through the agreement with the city?
This would just cover, this would just cover off-street parking. So any of that on-street where we have the agreement would still be in place, and this wouldn't affect that at all.
Thank you.
I think this is the area that I had questions, because it's a lot. And the thing that I had a question about had to do with the chart that showed how much you get for off-street parking. Yeah, okay, so this is that right zone spot. So, yeah, that one. So, how come, this is just for me educationally, how come the Central Business District has no requirement?
Well, the Central Business District has historically not had a requirement because of it was intended to have the public parking system provide the parking in the downtown area and not the uses down in downtown. So it was in order to, that I guess the biggest disincentive for urban development is parking. So once you start requiring parking, then you go from not having it more motor vehicle oriented development, and you get away from the buildings right up to the street, the consistent street wall that you see on Main Street. And so that it was decided that there would be no parking required in the downtown, and that the current system of parking lots and on-street parking would serve all those businesses in the downtown area.
So does that go with the 500-foot further on earlier when you talked about that everything got moved from 100 feet to 500 feet? So does that also, I guess what I'm trying to understand is in the shared parking lot area, so if I had a business in the Central Business District and then I knew that my employees and people shopping would have 500 feet from my business to park. That's the distance they could be away from my business. That's how far they would have to walk.
Well, if you were located outside of the Central Business District, you could have a parking lot that's not, within 500 feet of your business, and you could go through a, off-site parking lot in order to be able to utilize that parking lot in order to satisfy your parking requirement. Downtown, there is no parking requirement, and so you don't need to go through any type of joint use or shared parking or off-site parking because there isn't a requirement.
Okay, so I don't know if I'm crossing lines because of the Board of Adjustment thing, but so that made me wonder about because of the off-site parking when the business that came in, the auto business that came in and wanted to have off-site parking, you can come abroad. I just don't know. And they had parking issues, but if they were in the central business district, they actually didn't have to have.
Yeah, they're not required to have any parking, so they're not bound by any of the distance requirements. It was just reviewed through a conditional use permit, and the Board of Adjustment is allowed to review their proposal. Their proposal was to have the parking located off-site, and so there is no distance requirement that applies. It would just be the board's discretion as to whether or not they approved what they said in their application for that particular item.
Permit.
Yeah.
I think of what you're talking about. To clarify, that if it's a business, if it's by right, they wouldn't need to meet any of those. But if it's conditionally permitted, then there's a procedure where people have an opportunity to address their concerns so that the board would be able to mitigate the effects of the permissibly used or conditionally used business in that district. So if it's by right, there wouldn't be any issue about putting any requirements on it, but if it's conditionally permitted, it allows a government board to give some oversight as to what they could require to mitigate that effects, the negative effects.
And I don't remember that the board required it. They offered it as a way to mitigate concerns about, well, where are all your customers going to park their cars? Where are they going to drop them off? Where are you going to put them once they're finished? And the business proposed the off-site parking lot agreement with some places to be able to store cars
Yeah, I
to
think they
mitigate concerns.
Yeah, and I think they anticipated those would be the concerns
But they didn't even have to address them, is what you're saying.
if they were allowed by right, but it was the question whether
'Cause it was
they were allowed by
by
right.
right. Okay,
They
that
were
was the-
repairs, auto
Right.
repair, and minor repair was by right.
Right. Okay, so just to go a little further with that, don't go yet, Rod. So along with that then, I know that we have the hearing for CJ's.
Well, let's not talk about that.
We're not going to talk about that.
No.
I'm not talking about that. But what I'm saying is, that's in the downtown
That's in the central
Conditional
business
use.
district.
permit, but normally that business, as it was before the, before the.
Before they went out of business.
Yes, before they went out of business, then they didn't have to provide any parking.
Correct.
Okay. I'm just clarifying for my own education, that was.
Bar and
yeah.
restaurants is down there by right.
Okay. Thank you, that was very helpful. Which then goes to the next places we were going, which is all the meeting space requirements, which is this one I had. And there were things that didn't make sense to me here at all. So have you already talked about all that yet?
Well, this is just a table that we currently have in the code that just applies to urban mixed commercial. So that's the Legacy Crossing area, south of 6, west of Jackson, north of the South Couplet, and east of Paradise Creek. So that would just apply to that area in order to promote the infill development that the community had envisioned within that area. The council had limited or allowed a parking reduction for certain uses within that zone. So residential uses, we just have 50% of the minimum parking required by the code. So immediately, if you're required to have 6 spaces, you can cut that in half. You're only required to have 3. Hotel, we have specific requirements to say 1 stall per room. If it's convention meeting space, we have a specific requirement there. If it's any of those other uses, so office, retail, and other uses, there's no minimum parking specified. So that's similar to the downtown area where in order to promote this urban infill development, there needs to be a parking reduction in order to realize that.
Okay, so in that chart there, you had the convention meeting space at 1 space per 10 fixed seats and 1 per each 100 feet. And then underneath churches, it had, because I think of that as a meeting space, 1 per 30 seats. So I just didn't understand the difference between the two.
Well, this is, I think you're referring to our other table that goes through all the uses and those specific requirements. So this is, the table you're referring to is where this points you to. So like residential uses, minimum parking required by this code, we would go to the table, and I'll have that in the next, I'll cover that next here in the
Okay.
next slide. right after the accessibility section. So we'll I can go to that and come back, but yeah, right now we're not proposing to amend anything within the use table that discusses the minimum requirements depending upon the use. We're just looking at amending a couple portions of that. We'll come back, so as part of the use table project, use table code amendment, we're converting the code from narrative format into use table format. And so part of that is reviewing all the uses that we have and all ones that we don't have listed. And so as part of that, we'll bring a revised table, and then you can review all of the different categories and all the calculations as part of that project.
Okay,
but
gotcha.
right now, we're just addressing a couple of things that we had encountered recently that we had proposed to amend. So I guess the first and second one are single-family and two-family dwellings. Really had no issue with these over the years. So single-family, we require 2 per dwelling. Two-family, we require 2 per dwelling, so it results in 4 if it's a duplex. We have had a recent occurrence of buildings being constructed with 6 to 8 bedrooms that all contained individual bathrooms. That we're moving towards more of a cooperative living arrangement instead of just a single family living within a single family dwelling. And these were located in close proximity to the university and downtown. And once you start getting into an arrangement like that where you have 6 to 8 bedrooms with all individual bathrooms and it moves towards this cooperative housing arrangement, it's more of a multifamily dwelling at that point, even though it's not classified as such. And so that's one of the implications that we ended up running into is the off-street parking was not nearly enough in order to adequate that type of use as a cooperative living arrangement. And so Boise is running into this situation as well. They had just passed an emergency ordinance a few months ago regarding duplexes that are located close to BSU and having 6 to 8 bedrooms on each side and renting them out as more of university housing. Mm-hmm. And so this is not unique to Moscow. I think it's probably a new trend in being able to not meet all the accessibility requirements for multifamily dwellings. I think is one of the advantages to doing that type of development. So how we propose to account for that would be to require one parking space for each bedroom in excess of 4. So once you start getting into the 5, 6 range, usually if you have a single-family dwelling on Salonica or one of the, out on the outskirts of town, you have a large driveway, you have at least a 2-car garage, and so this, even if you have 5, 6 bedrooms as part of one of those houses, it won't affect this.
So, Mike, where on that chart are you putting this 6-bedroom home with 6 bathrooms?
Well, it'd be
left side or right side?
It'd be classified as a single-family dwelling still.
So you're putting it under the 2-family with the 1 for each in excess of 4?
Be putting it if it's a single-family, single-family dwelling that has 6
it's
to 8.
It's a 6-bedroom house with 6 bathrooms. It's got 6 college kids in it. Where do you plop that on the chart?
Still be a single-family dwelling.
Okay.
So, that because we can't call it something else, that's how we have to distinguish it.
And that's where your 2-family dwelling with 2 parking spaces per dwelling unit plus 1 for each in excess of 4 comes in.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And then the only other change that we'd be making right now, so taking into consideration, we're going to be in the next month or two, we'll be coming to council and having a new chart here to update our parking requirements for certain uses once we move through the use table ordinance. But the only other change we'd be making right now would be to strike a portion that discusses, so we have this increase in requirement depending upon if you're located next to an arterial collector street. And, this has been this is, I guess, is the intent behind this is that, typically if you have an arterial collector, there's no on-street parking. And so we want to increase the parking requirement in order to account for the lack of on-street parking adjacent to the spillover. And so what we had...
So you're doing away with that?
We were proposed to do away with that, yeah. We, had done some inventory of apartment complexes on A and Baker area that are all either adjacent to an arterial collector, and it came in about 85% full as far as the parking at, usually early in the morning when we can capture, when everybody's going to be at home. And so after those surveys, and then, you have the issue of maybe a road designation changing, and all of a sudden they're out of compliance with parking requirements. We thought we'd just be consistent with just one requirement and just strike that and just leave it at 0.75 per bedroom. And so that's the only other change we'd be proposing in this section. Then stepping back, this would be a new section. We'd just be relocating a portion of this. So right now, accessibility just points you to the American National Standards Institute, ANSI, as being the organization that puts out the book that you go off of for ADA requirements. We'd be inserting and expanding upon the current sentence that we have right now, and we have a portion that comes from the building code as well. And so this chart that talks about the number of parking spaces comes from the building code and lets you know, first 1 through 25, you're only required to have one ADA space. It has to be van accessible. Once you go above that, it all depends on how many spaces you have. So we'd be inserting that chart, and we'd also be inserting some illustrations. This is one of the common questions that we get asked is, what's the ADA stall dimension? You have a van accessible space, that needs to be the first space. So if you're required to have one space as part of your development, it's got to be a van accessible space. And so anything beyond the first one, you can have a standard accessible space. And so it's good to have these details. And then there's specific requirements from grade to the bottom of the signs that are located right in front of the space. And so it'd be good to have that illustration in there as well. That way we can just hand people this portion of the code and not try to verbally explain what the requirements are, because you end up getting out in the field and it may be different. So it's good to have illustrations in there to convey what the requirements are. In the case of, these requirements really haven't changed ever since 1991 when they were first implemented, but in the circumstance that there is some type of code amendment where the building code's amended or the ANSI book is amended to have differing standards, we just have a statement in there to cover that before we can get in there and actually amend it to include the new requirements. But we would just say that the building code and ANSI requirements take precedence over Figure 2 if there's different standards. So mainly just inserting illustrations within this portion. That brings us to a bicycle parking incentive. This is something that the commission as well as the committee were really enthusiastic about, was including incentive for bicycle parking and allowing a reduction in automobile spaces as part of a development. And so we're looking at reducing the total automobile spaces by 10% in order to provide bicycle parking. And if you recall, around the 2010 time frame, our department had proposed requiring bicycle parking as part of all new multifamily, institutional, and commercial development, and the council ended up not wanting to approve it at that time. Well, we had, obviously still had a copy of that ordinance, so we inserted a lot of the requirements as far as location, lighting, sheltering, the bicycle rack spacing and area, and then the bicycle rack types. There's probably a lot of conversation about not wanting like the wheel benders that you see, and wanting the, every bicycle rack now is usually the modified U or inverted A style. So, if we're going to allow an incentive, we want the bicycle parking to be meet a certain standard, not just a couple 2x4s attached to a building. So put those requirements in there. So with this 10% reduction, the amount of bicycle parking they need to provide is 4 times the total number of reduced automobile spaces. So if you had a 40 automobile parking lot and you were able to reduce it by 4 spaces, so that'd be 10%, you'd be required to provide 16 bicycle parking spaces in order to get that 4 automobile space reduction. So that's what we had worked on and come up with, and the committee was, like I said, enthusiastic about this, and the commission really liked it as well. And so
Yeah, it's
we're
cool.
proposing to insert that in the code.
And it only applies where you're asking for a reduction in required parking.
Correct. Yeah, it's not
So
not mandatory.
It's not across the board for,
It says incentive.
I'm sorry?
It says incentive.
I know, I'm just getting him to say so.
Yeah,
It does.
it'd just be an incentive. We went down that road, so we're not going to go down there.
Okay, in the packet, number 5 has now been changed to number 7. I don't know whether you're working from an editing copy or what.
Yeah, this was, I think, I just
okay.
carried this over. I'll update it for the council meeting. But yeah, it just.
Okay.
Yeah.
The bike rack sheltering in D, Mike?
Yeah.
That's going to virtually require freestanding shelter construction, isn't it?
Actually, a lot.
I mean, I know Walmart hung some awnings over some racks, but I don't think they would fit D. I don't think those awnings keep the rain off those bike spaces because they're not big enough.
Well, the awnings, actually, we had a member of the committee that wasn't required to, just ended up doing covered bicycle parking as part of his multifamily development, and that's what he did, was just do an awning off of the building in order to cover it. Usually in multifamily, you have the internal stairwells that usually you see bikes parked, maybe they're attached to the railing,
Right.
but we would require actual spaces. And so usually those are good areas because all multifamily developments typically have those internal stairwell corridors that may be exposed, but they're covered. And so, that's a pretty easy
That
location.
would cover them. The Walmart type, though, that protect the entire bicycle parking space from precipitation, I would question if that
Well, I remember going out to.
would meet that. I
Yeah,
mean,
and it did. I mean,
unless it's a wind from the north, and these are on the south side of the building, I'm suspecting that space is going to get wet even with that little awning over them.
Yeah, I mean, if it's a horizontal rain or snow, then you're probably hard pressed to.
Suggest it doesn't have to be horizontal. I mean, I looked at them today
Yeah.
for some reason.
I remember,
I was
yeah,
out there.
and we, I think originally when they installed those, they had slats, and we required them to have some type
A
of
solid piece?
solid piece over the top of that in order to prevent any type of precipitation from coming
To
down
reduce
onto
it,
it.
okay.
But yeah. And that brings us to the last section, which is the landscaping requirements section. Right now, you have a purpose statement that discusses the reason for parking lot landscaping. And when it was written, a lot of it hinged on just protecting and improving appearance, character, value of surrounding neighborhoods, and providing buffers between parking lot areas and adjoining land uses. And the commission really wanted to, highlight all the great things that landscaping does within parking lots. And so we've gone through and beefed that section up in the beginning to promote general welfare. So reducing noise levels and glare, filtering stormwater runoff, reducing the urban heat island effect, filtering vehicular emissions, stabilizing soils, providing shade to users of parking lots, promoting safety by directing traffic circulation through parking lots. And then the committee, you can see there in the purple, ended up wanting to increase that even more to include native plantings and xeriscaping are encouraged for water savings, reduced maintenance, reduction in fertilizers and pesticides, increased pollination, and a reduction in yard waste. So, not requiring xeriscaping or native plantings, but just encouraging that those are used as part of developments. So that goes through the purpose section, and then we go through an application. And right now, we have usually these landscape areas are broken out into interior and exterior landscaping. Right now, ours are kind of intermingled. There's not two really different sections. We have a definition of landscaping where we go through the minimum requirements. So right now, a tree that's 7 feet in overall height immediately after planting is what's required if there's a tree required. And then if there are shrubs required, they have to be at least 2 feet in height. Well, the industry standard is not really measurement of the height. It's usually for trees, it's caliper. So it's 1.5 inch caliper. For shrubs, when you order those, it's typically gallon is the measuring tool in order to order those. And so, this has been, in the past, has been problematic because, a lot of things that we get here in town, a lot of plantings are not of those heights. And so you run into an issue with maybe a development's all been landscaped and some of those don't meet the 2-foot requirement, but they maybe will in 6 months. And so, going towards more of a gallon caliper measurement is a lot more universal way of, being more equitable towards all development through the process. And so we'd be looking at amending that section to move in that direction. And then we allow, or we require, the exterior landscaping. So right now we've got 2 sections, landscaping adjacent to a public right-of-way, so like a street, and landscaping relative to adjacent properties. These are pretty similar. It's almost redundant language. They say about the same thing. And so what we'd be proposing to do is just consolidate that. And so we'd be moving from this large section here to a section that's rather small and concise. And so we would just have required exterior landscaping, and then we would just say that off-street parking landscaping shall be provided between off-street parking lots and abutting public rights-of-way and adjacent properties. So similar to what we have now. The buffer strip has to be 3 feet in width, so that's currently what we have right now as well. So we'd be maintaining that, and then list everything that needs to be within that 3-foot buffer. So we'd need 1 tree of 1.5 inch caliper every 40 lineal feet. So we'd be proposing right now within parking lots we require 1 tree every 10 parking spaces. And so, this is a more, and it's always been up to the discretion of the developer as to where they put those. And so we could end up with 3 trees over in one corner of the parking lot, and they're not evenly dispersed throughout the parking lot. And so, in review of the research from a lot of the other jurisdictions, that's typically what they did, is they would have the buffer requirement, and then you'd have a certain number of shrubs and trees within that buffer. And so we'd be moving towards more consistent requirement of 1 tree of 1.5 inch caliper every 40 lineal feet is what we'd be proposing there.
Which is handy, given that we're changing the size of the spaces.
Yeah. Yep.
Mike, what you've got on the screen doesn't look like the picture in the packet. There are parts of it that's the same. Is that the proposed new?
This I just did. It doesn't have track changes on it, so I've got a clean version.
Yeah, we just have
is
that.
what I'm looking at.
Does yours look like mine, which is?
I don't have a 2 application item in what I'm looking at. But it does way back up there, and then there's a lot of strikes. And then it changed, 2 goes directly to number 3, placement. Okay, well, maybe it's because of the strike and score that I can't keep up with it. And then there's an item called interior landscaping, which I don't see up on the screen.
Yeah, that'll be next. So we're just covering exterior
Okay.
right now.
All right, that may be the difference, is striking scores hard to follow.
If you want that, you can have that.
So 40 feet
Okay,
is better
okay,
than
I think I'm,
spaces.
Yeah, all the striking was hard to follow, and so I just did a clean one on the screen so we could see what the final
okay.
would look
All right,
like.
I think we're good.
Okay. So we have the tree for, one every 40 lineal feet, and then we have shrub requirements. So wouldn't be really changing anything here. We have one shrub every 6 feet on center within that 3-foot buffer that we require right now. We'd be changing the 2-foot height requirement to 1 gallon for perennial and at least 2 gallons in size for deciduous or evergreen. So we'd be specifying that. And that was largely a committee recommendation. The landscapers that were on that said that's really an industry standard as far as those measurements. And so we'd be changing that. And then had a statement in there about the shrubs at maturity shall provide visual relief of a minimum of 3 feet in height. And that's really what we have right now is the intention. And 50% shall be evergreen. So that would be a new addition, that the 50% be evergreen. If the intent is to, provide this visual relief and buffering, then if you have deciduous that, or perennials that lose their leaves in the winter, then you're not maintaining that buffering, and that's why a lot of jurisdictions go towards 50% be evergreen in order to maintain the foliage year-round. So that would be the addition to the shrubs section. And then based upon a lot of the operating characteristics of parking lots and testimony about vehicular site obstruction. So we, P&Z reviewed a lot of parking lots that maybe had the wrong choice in tree that prevented some safety issues going, just maneuvering the parking lot. And so we wanted to include a statement that consideration shall be given to the selection of trees and shrubs that at maturity do not present vehicular site obstructions at driveway street intersections. So including that statement at the end. And then that brings us to the parking lot interior landscaping. Right now we have a section that is really unlike any other section within any other jurisdiction. We have these internal landscape islands that are 36 inches in width, and they're intended to divide the area into bays of approximately equal size. And then we have this really high threshold that's less than 50 spaces, no divisions required. And really the intention, I think, is geared towards more rectangular, symmetrical parking areas. Mm-hmm. So take, for instance, La Quinta as parking area, and this is really, how these requirements have been implemented and required in the past. You have the 3-foot strip, and it's dividing the area into 2 distinct bays. And this is fine for larger parking lots. Like you take for example Walmart's parking lot. That's really what they have. They have vertical, landscape islands that divide the parking lot into bays. This really becomes problematic with maintenance and snow removal, especially. And a lot of the other jurisdictions provide a lot better flexibility with just specifying the parking space sized islands. So you can see like these here as the landscape island requirement instead of the long stretching island at the front of all these parking spaces. And so so that's why you have this large threshold of 50 parking spaces, is because we have this unique island configuration that we talk about in the code. This is probably we had dedicated 1 meeting towards, or maybe 1.5 meetings at the committee level, just discussing the threshold for parking lot internal islands. And so you had, going from this differing requirement of the long 3-foot wide landscape island to these, similar to the parking space size end cap islands that you see in most parking lots. And looking at the research, a lot of those are required within other jurisdictions at a lot lower of a rate. So Looking at the table attached to your packet here, usually once you get to a 12-stall parking lot, that's when parking lot islands are required in most other jurisdictions. Pullman kicks in at about 20. And so we had originally proposed that parking lot islands be required once you hit the 20 parking space threshold. There was half of the members of the committee that wanted to keep the 50, and then there was another half that wanted to keep the recommendation at 20. And so they couldn't compromise. That was, pretty much compromised and recommended everything else. But this is one of the items that they really couldn't compromise on, and so it went to Planning and Zoning Commission. The commission ended up compromising for them and increased it to 30. So once you hit 30 spaces, that's when parking lot islands are proposed to be required. And then you go through, we have specifications for what those islands are, so they have to be at least 8 feet in width, and that's measured from the perimeter, the inside of the perimeter curbing, and then a length equivalent to the adjacent parking space. So you're looking at, typically an 8-foot wide by 20 feet deep island.
At
Yes.
one point, I remember a discussion about providing for pedestrian safety in larger parking lot areas that included sidewalks so people weren't walking up the traffic lanes. Is that still a part of all this? Because I don't recall seeing it.
That's already contained within the code. So earlier on, we have a requirement that pedestrian sidewalks be provided. I think you get up to 150. So it says parking areas with. So if you scroll to page 5 of the ordinance. Parking areas with 150 or more spaces shall include pedestrian walkways or other such facilities to ensure the safe passage of pedestrian traffic through the parking area. So we have that in there already. We do require an accessible route for all multifamily, commercial, and institutional uses already. So this is just addressing those larger parking lots.
Clearly,
So
I did not read carefully enough.
that's all right. So we go back through the required size for parking lot islands, and then once you hit that threshold of 30 spaces, then you have a frequency of 1 island for every 12 parking spaces, evenly distributed in the parking lot. And then the islands have to be protected by curbing, and they shall contain at least 1 tree of 1.5-inch caliper, shrubs of at least 1 gallon in size perennial. So we carried over the same recommendation for the buffer for the external vegetative ground cover, and then wanted to specify that landscape islands adjacent to double rows of parking stalls, and then we inserted the illustration here just to say that these are actually 2 islands and not just counted as 1. So I wanted to specify that. And then just had a couple other sub-bullets that said consideration shall be given of parking lot trees not to interfere with lot lighting or present vehicular sight obstructions. And so there's quite a bit of discussion as to you put the lights in and then all of a sudden you have nowhere to put the trees. And so the committee wanted the ability for the zoning administrator, so staff, in order to approve the relocation of trees in those circumstances to other locations in the parking lot. And so just wanted to include a little bit of flexibility there. So with that, I'm done.
Well, that's
So-
great. Do you have a question?
Nope.
Do you have a question, Walter?
Are we going to do this whole thing at council on Monday night?
Yep.
Yes.
Suspicion is that is exactly what will happen.
Yeah, this is exciting. Huh?
Hopefully, Mike's explained it so well that
For 3 of us.
take an hour and a
Well,
half
no,
to do
I
it.
have a question, though. It has
As
to do
interesting as it was.
the zoning administrator. So there were so many crossouts that, usually it went to the committee, and then now the zoning administrator. So the zoning administrator will be the public works director or
Community Development Director.
Community Development. Okay, and because I didn't know that, and that's in the code, it's always going to be one person. And then once they make that decision, how do they communicate it to the rest of the people that might need to know that information? That's the only thing I wondered about. Because you know how when things go to committee, a lot of times then that information gets filtered, I mean, not filtered, but disseminated. So when the zoning administrator makes a decision, because now there's so many pieces of this that can be part of the zoning administrator's purview, which is good, just to make sure that that is clearly understood by all the people that are going to be affected by the decision.
Well, usually it's just the applicant that's affected by the decision.
That's it.
So, yeah. So they, they have a tree that is affected by a light, and they ask us to be able to relocate that, or maybe it's the landscape contractor. We would just work with them as staff in order to give some flexibility in order to relocate
And
that.
this becomes like a checkbox. Yes, we did that with this.
Yeah,
apartment.
it's just more of a code requirement that they, going through the building permit process, it would just be one of those things that, we'd give a little bit of flexibility to them, and then on the final approved plans, they would just show the new location of the tree or shrub or whatever it was they needed to move. So it'd be all documented there.
Okay, thank you. So with no further questions, I think this goes on to regular council since it's going to be an ordinance, and you get to present again. Thanks, Mike.
In good voice.
Yeah.
Good job.
Next on the agenda is consideration of renaming Blackbird Crossing to Blackbird Station, and that's Dwight Curtis. Oh, but David Schott's going to do the presenting.
And we can do it, too.
We
Do
can
it before 6, too.
We need to set up before 6.
we can do it. You're with a classroom teacher. We can do a lot. Logistics.
He's going right to the last slide.
Hi, David.
Hi, how's the committee doing today?
Good, thanks.
Good. I'll try to get through this fairly quickly. This is the consideration of the name change for Blackbird Crossing. As you recall, this was approved by council on April 14th of 2014, the conceptual plan for Blackbird Crossing. This came from the Pathways Commission on their December 16th or December 13th, 2016 Pathways Commission meeting, where they deliberated and made a recommendation to change the name from Blackbird Crossing to Blackbird Station, because crossing would give people the impression that it's safe to cross Highway 8 there over to East Side Marketplace, and we certainly don't want them crossing there, uncontrolled intersection. This is supported by the city and the Idaho Transportation Department. Just a bit of history. In 2008, this idea really came to council to do a crossing, a rest area for bicyclists. This was in 2013. The naming process really began. We used our resolution for park naming. That was considered Parks and Rec Commission in 2013 with a 60-day public comment period. Later in August, they approved the name Blackbird Crossing, and it was officially named Blackbird Crossing in September of 2013 by council. Some history. This was the winning nomination was provided by former Mayor Nancy Cheney in a 2013 letter that she wanted to name this Blackbird Crossing for numerous reasons. Back to now, the process, we use the naming policy, although this is a renaming, is kind of the benchmark for process. Again, this came from the Pathways Commission. We went to the Parks and Recreation Commission meeting. They supported the recommendation, so that began a 60-day public comment period, which closed on April 3rd. We did receive 3 written comments. I'd like to briefly take a moment and just go through those comments. So we had one from Marie Miller with the police department. She'd like to post the area, otherwise people will cross regardless of the danger. And I think the name is a good idea too. So these are all in your packet. Kevin Lilly with our engineering department also prefers Blackbird Station. And then former Mayor Nancy Cheney did write a letter that's included in your packet. I'll read a couple excerpts if I can take a moment. As the originator of the name, I'm still partial to Blackbird Crossing. Early on, the site was informally referred to as Trail Station, included by me. So I wouldn't lose sleep over changing crossing to station, but I doubt the rationale would deter people from crossing Highway 8. The landscaping is supposed to prevent this. She likes the dynamic wording Blackbird Crossing over Blackbird Station. She was seeking inspiration, saw Blackbird Crossing the pathway when she thought up the name. Blackbird Crossing implies vitality and forward momentum. Blackbird Station, an otherwise fine name, does not. Thank you for your consideration, so on and so forth. So, and her full letter's in your packet for consideration. With those comments, we brought those back to the Parks and Recreation Commission, which did recommend the name change. And so here we are, Administrative Committee, to consider the name change.
I think the name change is appropriate. It maintains the feel and nature of why it was named that originally, and does discourage the fact that people can cross Highway 8 right there, and because otherwise be flattened blackbirds out there. So no. But yeah, I think it does what we want, and I like the fact that there was a unanimous recommendation to change the name.
I've got no problem with the name change. Is there any plan to cut the ditch back in on the highway side of that thing?
Yes.
I mean, I saw somebody crossing it 2 days ago.
I think that we can talk about that, but since we're okay with the name thing, can we hold up on that one since Gary's reminding me that we have to have this commission?
We've got 10 minutes till 6 o'clock. Is there any plan to cut a ditch in as
Yes.
part of the construction?
Part of our right of use permit with Idaho Transportation Department is going to require us to bring a ditch in and match the current embankment along Highway 8 there.
So it will physically deter
Physically, there'll be a ditch
people
there.
wanting to
That'd be
cross
good.
there. Okay, good.
Anything else?
That's it.
All right. That's it. We'll put this on the regular agenda so you can present. Thank you.
This is on the regular agenda?
Yeah, I think that the rest of the council would like to hear what David had to say and how this has gone through the process. I mean, it started in 2013, so
Okay.
nice culmination to finishing something up.
Thank you, just clarifying.
Let's adjourn.
Let's adjourn. Thank you.